Mr. Price Group is principally a value-oriented, cash-only fashion retailer, but also has a homeware and sportswear division. The group has its origins in John Orr stores, but the first Mr. Price stores opened in 1987. It has a market cap of 28 billion rand and a price-to-earnings ratio of 22. You have been singing the joys of Mr. Price since we started the show. I mean, should I just jump straight to hot or not on this one?
You know what, Mr. Price, it's also rallied quite aggressively, you know, but I still believe that, following on from the comment that I've been making, that the African continent in terms of formalizing retail is not there yet. I think probably penetration is anything between 5 to 15% at most. So our guys going through to the rest of Africa comes in nicely into Mr. Price's forte. So I do think I'll be a blame Mr. Price for the long term, definitely.
And picking up on what Owen said earlier, that the affluent in the African markets generally go to Europe to buy their clothes, but those that aren't so lucky are buying for cash from the likes of Mr. Price.
Yeah, look, there's certainly a big gap there. I mean, the super affluent maybe go to Europe, and at the bottom end of the market in a country like Nigeria, there are actually a lot of second-hand clothes which come out of Europe. They get donated to charities who basically sell them. They get baled and sent off to places like Nigeria and sold in the street markets. So we're talking about a niche somewhere in between those two. Look, Mr. Price, a very well-run company. When Laurie Chiappini and Stuart Cohen, that's right, bought it in 1987 out of receivership effectively, they really went well with the concept. And this thing about buying is not to be underestimated. They send buyers around the world. They look at what's selling in their competitor stores, and then they get stuff made in China and elsewhere. So very well niched, and not just cheap and nasty. It's kind of stylish, cheap, and not nasty. So I think they've got a great business formula, and they've really extended that and can continue to do that. So I like where they're positioned, and I like the model going upwards.
Last night we were chatting about Truworths and Forshini, and Truworths admitting that they had got their seasonal merchandising wrong. And Forshini had a similar experience a couple of years back. Mr. Price hasn't had any trouble on this front, or have they, Owen?
No, I don't think they have. I mean, Mr. Price has got it spot on, definitely. You must, or rather, the one perception I consistently get from investors out there is that Mr. Price is not necessarily a low-end to middle-income store anymore. You're getting guys who used to buy the top end from the Truworths and the Forshinis, now also considering some of the lines that are coming through at Mr. Price.
Because they've got their buying so spot on, as Paul was saying.
Absolutely. Their mix is really great, and I think it can only get better, in my view, from Mr. Price, and their pricing is relatively affordable. And you know, the only thing that could challenge them, I think, in my view, is if we see a continued weakening in the currency, maybe that could just squeeze margins a little bit. But for the long term, you'd still want to be involved in this business.
Can you get excited about the African story on Mr. Price?
I think so. I mean, you know, it's got a long road to travel, and it's a competitive space, but I think they can. You know, they had guys like Neville Trickett, who was like a design guru who was involved with their clothing purchasing and styling and so on. And I'm not sure if he's still involved, but they can continue to extend that. But remember, not everything that works in one country necessarily works in another. As far as the portfolio is concerned, they own a few odd things like Milady's. They've got the sports, Mr. Price sports stuff, which I think needs some work, but that's just me in terms of the sort of sports brand.
And of course, you were saying last night that you love your sports brands.
Yeah, and I think that's a great category.
You have your finger on the pulse here.
But like, you know, if you own Nike globally, that's kind of a premium sports equipment brand. But
what is your preferred sports brand?
That would be it, Nike. But now to go back and to do the sort of discount sports stuff, because, you know, Mr. Price sports brand is called Maxed. But, you know, whether that will really dominate in that niche is not sure. Then the home stores worry me a little bit, because I'm not quite sure that that's as compelling an opportunity. But then again, you know, with their Kitchen Confidential and all of the sort of homewares and basic cutlery and crockery, they seem to have a nice niche there as well.
Oh, and let's get your thoughts on this diversification. How do you feel about Mr. Price at home?
Look, Mr. Price at home, I think it's also properly positioned, in my view. The home side of things was started off by Forshini through At Home, but that was obviously for the higher tier guys. And you see what's continuing to happen in the South African consumer space. Look at what's happening with vehicle sales. You know, the consumer is still very active. And I think people are now starting to get an understanding of the fact that you don't just buy a house, you know, you have to plan around how you furnish it, how you've got to buy proper cutlery, etc. And there is some good traffic going into Mr. Price home stores, and they're relatively still affordable as well.
And what about the sports element? The Mr.
I agree with Paul. I mean, I think I was actually surprised when I saw one branch of Mr. Price Sports. I was in Durban actually when I saw it, and I don't think they're that significant a player in the space. Whereas a Whole Sports, for example, and a Total Sports is a brand that you'll see when you walk into.
And people who love their sports possibly love their brands associated with.
Look, it's an interesting strategy because like Sports Scene and Total Sports specifically kind of selling other people's brands like Nike and Adidas and so on, very high premium, quite high expensive, high margin type approach. But Mr. Price wanted to try taking their wind out of those sales by going a notch or two lower. In this Sportsman's Warehouse, you do see those brands and then the in-house brands. But I think quality is an issue, and so they'll carry on working at it in order to get it to where it needs to be.
Hot or not on Mr. Price at current prices, gentlemen, you've got to take into account this one has run.
Current price for the short term, not hot, but long term will still be a player.
All right, I'll take that as a dual answer. Paul?
Yeah, I think they've got the chops, and I like the internal management process. So even at 110 Rand, I think it's still got further to go. So hot for me.